violence by a large population is not because this people is more violent than any other. It's an alarm, it's a sign, it's a signal that something is wrong in the treatment of this population.
Where is the outcry? Where is the voice of the people? Where is the voice of the people?
Economic exploitation and social degradation. All of them from the same enemy.
It is useless, futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against the godless brutal class. He is only savage attack on an unarmed defenseless people.
This year will be a year of violence. This year will make the keynote is violence and the slogan is attack.
I am minded of young David. I am minded of young David, the shepherd boy, who stood up before the great warrior of the Philistines. Young David having all the courage. There must be someone somewhere. There must be someone. There's got to be somebody somewhere. Got to be somebody somewhere. Young David took that one small stone and in the faith of his God and then slayed the giant.
Pathé Dispatch shows the scene in Jerusalem as Jewish and Arab mobs clashed in the center of the city. It remains to be seen whether a threatened full-scale war will materialize.
جنود يعتلون منازل والقناصة لا يتورعون عن إطلاق النار على كل شيء يمر أمامهم بمن فيهم الصحفيين.
As a journalist, the more you look into the issue of Israel and Palestine, the more you sense that something is not quite right. The images and the narration are out of sync, a little like a foreign film that has been awkwardly dubbed.
بيوت مهدمة وطرق مدمرة وسيارات لم يعد يظهر منها إلا هياكلها، أما الطعام والدواء فوجوده نادرا.
As you look into it for yourself, you begin to suspect that there is something extremely odd going on. The more you look into it, the more you begin to feel it is not just odd, it is deeply disturbing. Our media portray Mideast violence as though it's an inherent part of the culture and region, implying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an ancient problem with little hope of solution.
دمار يخلفه الجيش الإسرائيلي في كل شبر من الضفة الغربية. مدينة السلام المحاصرة لا زالت ترفع غصن الزيتون، وكنيسة المهد تقصف بالآليات العسكرية. 200 مواطن محاصرون داخل الكنيسة دون طعام أو دواء.
These misperceptions come from the fact that we're only hearing a fraction of the story. You are about to witness images and testimony largely hidden from mainstream America.
This place draws many people, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. This is a holy place to significant numbers of us in the world. We all have an interest in sort of seeing what is this land and what's the situation here. And once you come, if you open your eyes at all, you can't miss the problems and the patterns that are here.
I think it's hard to understand what occupation is. I think it's a foreign concept for many Americans, what it's like to live under military occupation.
The definition of an occupation is when a foreign army occupies your land physically and controls your life.
In addition, Palestinians under occupation, and this is why there's so much struggle against the occupation, they're not citizens, they don't have rights, they don't have civil rights. They're under a military rule.
This is a particular kind of occupation that's both military and settler occupation.
Settlements are areas of Palestinian land which are selected, and whatever is there, whether it's roads or whether it's villages or homes, they're bulldozed, and then a new town is built on the hilltop.
One very good friend is Rodina Jabber, and she and her husband Appa have land in a rural valley near here called the Ba'a. And it's pretty clear these settlements want this land. It's some of the best agricultural land around here. So that valley has had repeated home demolitions. Rodina herself has lived through 2 home demolitions. They're living now in their 3rd house.
اجت الجرافه طبعا مع الجيش اللي هجم علي على الخيمه انا التخمت تهدوا ما تهدوا بنتقاتل انا وياهم انا اصيح ما يصير صاروا يضربوني في راسي وكان لي بكله وشعر هيك مسكني من شعري ومنكب شعري لما حطوا بكيت الجرافه على البيت هيك تذكرت انه ابني نايم في البيت هجمت على البيت بدي اطوله احمله أنا بركض على البيت والجيش بيسحب فيي من ظهري من ورا وبضرب فيي في ظهري وشلبيت في رجلي وراسي ومسك شعري من البكلة وخلع شعري. أنا جريت الجندي ودفعته على الأرض واحد منهم هيك مدقرين فيه كلهم. أنا دبيت الجندي ودخلت على الولد حملته بين إيدي هيك وطلعت.
Rodina and her children were once again homeless and had to endure living in a tent for many months. Her husband Atta was even imprisoned for protesting the destruction of their home.
قاعدين أنا وياهم قاعدة بطبخ لهم على الحطب وعلى النار قاعدة بطبخ لهم. رابطة حبل في التينة خيط حبل رابطها في التينة من فوق وبتلف على رقبتها وحاطة هيك بتشنق في حيلها. يما شو بتساوي شو هذا؟ قال خلص يعني احنا بدنا نضل قاعدين في الشمس تحت التينة بدناش نعيش بدنا نموتها. فكيتها يعني ساعتها كان الوضع مأساة وبشكل يعني تصور قديش ام قاعدة من ولادها بنتحروا قدامها. يعني حالتها بالنفسية لا تحت الصفر. في الليل حتى الليل والله ما بنناموا بالليل. طول الليل والله ما بنناموا. يما شوفي مين يما شوفي الجيش يعني قبل 3 أيام أجانا الجيش، هذا تصوت من شقة وهذا يصرخ من شقة وهذا حاملته، والجيش بيقول هاتي هويتك، هاتي الهوية، ومن دون ضوء. الأولى ما بضربوش، بسكت فيهم، بمسكهم بعبطهم، أنا بكون خايفة أكثر منهم. شو بدنا نسوي؟
Here you have Palestinians that have no input whatsoever in the policies that are made. They're not on the city council. They're not in any of the decision-making bodies in the West Bank or Gaza. They're certainly not in the government. The policies are made in order to ensure Israeli control. So the law is designed in a way, in a very cynical way, to prevent Palestinians from building and to keep them confined in little islands, so that most of the land of the occupied territories is free for Israeli settlement.
These are armed settlements, about 190 of them spread all over the West Bank.
Settlements are strategically built colonies of Israel that are connected by a network of roads which separate each Palestinian community from the next and confine their ability to expand. They are often constructed around the best farmland and water resources.
They are surrounded by barbed wire. They are armed inside. Settler residents are required to be armed by the Israeli military. And they are defended from the outside by the Israeli military itself.
The purpose of these settlements today, number one, is to continue the Israeli control and domination of the occupied territories.
And the bottom line in all of this is to make Palestinians leave the country. It's a very hard term, I know, but in a sense it's a kind of ethnic cleansing.
The Israeli government and the Israeli army is not dealing with people as equal. I mean, I think that that's the main problem, that Palestinians are not considered, are not perceived as equals to Israelis.
There is no specific discrimination against Palestinian Christians as opposed to Palestinian Muslims. It's a shared suffering.
Christians see them themselves very much a part of the Palestinian national movement. They identify with the Palestinian people as being their people.
Palestinian Christians have difficulty getting to churches on Sunday morning if they wanted to come to Jerusalem because they don't have that permission or that legal right, according to the Israeli government, to come to Jerusalem for worship.
This I picked up in a home of a wonderful Christian family in Beit Jala. And this is the kind of armor-piercing weaponry that's being used against civilians, innocent civilians.
It's not easy to tell everything, you know. It's easy to say some words, but you can't tell how they feel. As everybody, I want my children to be happy, to live their right life as children. We just think about one thing. Where can I put my children while they are shooting? They didn't want to go to school because they are scared to come back and there is no house. They doesn't want to go home without me and the father because they think that they will lose us. What about these children? Why they are going to the streets? They don't think, let's go to swim. Because I'm sure they have no right to swim now. Why? Because we are Palestinian. Thanks God. I don't imagine that there is a woman in all of the world can send their child or her man just go to die. Do you think we are working all of this life to give them something and to let them die in a minute? Can you?
The suffering, the persecution of Christians, they've been robbed of their heritage. They've been robbed of their ancestral lands. They've been robbed of their culture.
Some of the first converts to the teachings of Jesus were Palestinians. So that's how long Christians have been in that land. Their quarter, the Christian quarter, has been really, really decimated and taken over and sliced up.
That has really bled the Christian community to where they're less than 2% of the population now.
The presence of a Christian community within the Holy Land, can you imagine, where Jesus first stepped foot, will no longer be there.
I know both from the moral sense and from the practical sense that the only way to stop the violence is to treat the root cause from which the violence has started.
The number one myth that Westerners have about this conflict is that Arabs and Jews have been fighting for thousands of years and they're going to continue to fight.
This is really quite bizarre because all it takes is a little bit of reading of history to find out that this just isn't true. There is no congenital historical enmity between the Arabs and the Jews. The Jews flourished in the Arab world at a time when they were being persecuted throughout all of Europe.
At the end of the 19th century, because of anti-Semitism in Europe, European Jews began to try and figure out a solution to the Jewish problem. A very small minority adhered to Zionism, the idea that the only place in which they could be safe is within a Jewish state.
Zionist Jews actually had a design on the land of Palestine, the idea of creating a homeland for Jews in the land of Palestine. And this is really the beginning of the conflict.
The mainstream Israeli Jewish society believed, because that's the way they had been educated, that Palestine was empty, had been empty when the Jewish settlers came there.
Who paid the price when they settled there? Is it really true that Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land?
Palestine was not empty. It was a land populated by Arabs who had a high level of culture, high level of education.
With farms and markets and towns and villages and roads and commerce and lots of interaction with the rest of the world.
The population was overwhelmingly Arab.
Jewish immigration increased under British rule following World War I, when Britain implemented the Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This measure conflicted with Britain's previous promise of self-rule for Arab inhabitants throughout the region.
Britain was basically extremely supportive of the Zionist movement. It helped to establish all of the structures of a state. At the same time, the Arabs of Palestine were denied the right of self-determination.
The Palestinians saw a European power decide the future of a non-European territory, in flat disregard of both their presence and wishes. In the 1920s, as land was being stripped away from local residents, the first clashes between Palestinians and Jews began, and would continue on for years to come. Until the early 1930s, the Jewish population of Palestine remained under 17%. Hitler's rise to power in Germany completely changed that. In just 5 years, 174,000 Jews flooded into Palestine, doubling their population. As the world attempted to make amends for the horrors of Nazi genocidal policies, efforts to make Palestine a Jewish homeland increased.
The Palestinians, they were not the Nazis. They were not responsible for the Holocaust. But they were the ones who paid the price.
In 1947, with the conflict spiraling out of control, Britain decided to turn the problem of Palestine over to the United Nations. The UN, under pressure, proposed to divide the land into 2 states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. Arabs were to be given 43% of the land, despite the fact that they made up more than 2/3 of the population and owned over 92% of the land. Jews were to be given 56%, although they comprised only 1/3 of the population and owned less than 8% of the total area.
Nevertheless, they were given not only most of the land, they were given the most fertile land.
Zionist leaders took advantage of their superior military preparation and immediately began occupying major Arab cities in Palestine.
I was among the people that conquered Akko. We were walking around, we entered the flat. There was a pair of shoes of a small child, maybe 2 years old. They didn't have time to put on the shoes, so they left the shoes and they ran away. They left everything.
We found out that there was a systematic expulsion of Palestinians, and there was, as I said, there was an ethnic cleansing operation taking place.
The most infamous campaign was the massacre at the village of Deir Yassin, where over 100 men, women, and children were systematically murdered.
هذا البيت فكان متخبين فيه أنا وولادي وأخويا موسى. نكليت أنا معد أخوي موسى مشان كان نتونس بالله فيه هذا البيت. أجوا قالوا من لما كنا بالبيت كنا رفقنا مش كسر خبطنا الكنبلة وجينا ست صوبتنا وبنت الصواب لبسة ولادي. وكان بعد ما راحت المراكة الحركة كسروا الباب عليهم وطلعونا وقدم يقتل أخوي مسدبة فيه على وجهه اللي يقتلوه. وتناولت 250 ليرة من عدة وقلت يا خواجه بس مشان الله هالقالي بدها ست قلت ليش؟ قال لي كتير انت كويس هات المصاري وبعد شو كنت الحنو شو تسوي فيها كنت الحنو اجى هات الولي يزيدك على السلام تحلو هذا لكن يعود حتى في النصين لا يكون راسك موسى قدام حتى 5 لا يفتح راسه.
The ruthlessness of the attack on Deir Yassin drove fear and panic into the Palestinian population and led to the flight of unarmed civilians from their homes all over the country.
As a result, maybe 300 or so thousand Palestinians had already been expelled before the first Arab soldier entered Palestine.
Some of the neighboring Arab armies finally intervened after May 15, 1948, when Israel officially announced its statehood.
Although there was a lot of war rhetoric on the Arab side, very few soldiers, Arab soldiers, were sent into the battlefield. And actually, for most parts of the war, there was superiority on the side of the Israeli army.
The Israeli army cleansed much of the territory and took over a large part of the designated Palestinian state.
The new state of Israel encompassed 78% of the total land of Palestine. The West Bank came under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian dominion. Although a truce was declared between Israel and the Arab states, true peace remained elusive, as over 700,000 Palestinian refugees languished in nearby camps, often in sight of homes to which they still held the deeds and a deep desire to return.
Most of the deserted and evicted Palestinian villages were erased from upon the earth and were either turned into Jewish settlements or into fertile land.
Of the 500 Palestinian villages in what became Israel in 1948, 400 were destroyed.
These efforts to destroy the possibility of their returning home were countered by the United Nations, which continues to affirm their human right enshrined in international law and morality to return.
A Palestinian who had lost her land or lost his land as a result of the creation of Israel in 1948 cannot come back even for a visit. I can go back to Israel as if I were returning and claim immediate citizenship, having no historic tie, speaking no Hebrew, knowing no one in the country, having no family who ever was there. All that one needs is being Jewish, a religious group like any other.
I know the Arabs are very good, no problem till the Zionist movement start. My grandmother told me before the Zionist movement start, they babysitting each other, the kids. They borrow from both each other like brothers, like brothers. The idea of Zion take away the land from the Palestinians and the Arabs is starting the whole fighting. Not Arabs the problem, not Jews the problem, not Judaism, not Muslim, only Zionism.
The events of 1948 were a defining moment for the Middle East, and from that point onward created instability throughout the region. Violent tensions continued and led to another war in 1967. In that war, Israel occupied the remainder of historic Palestine, what is known today as the West Bank and Gaza.
Another myth was that Israel was about to be pushed into the sea, but I was working in the State Department at that time. There was no question of Israel being pushed into the sea. The question was just the rapidity and the totalness of the Israeli victory, and the victory was crushing.
During the 1967 war, Israel displaced more than 400,000 Palestinians, half of whom were 1948 refugees, displaced for a second time in less than 2 decades. It became clear that the world was not going to address their plight. Palestinians in Israel lived as third-class citizens of a state whose core identity excluded them, while those in the newly occupied territories and abroad continued as dispossessed refugees. The United Nations passed resolution after resolution affirming their rights. Leaders of surrounding Arab nations verbally championed their cause, but failed to take action. Finally, Palestinians took matters into their own hands. There was a mass uprising, in Arabic an intifada, shaking off, as people throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip rebelled. The Israeli government adopted a strategy, in the words of Defense Minister Itzhak Rabin, of might, power, and beatings, which became known as the break the bone strategy. Thousands of Palestinians were rounded up and imprisoned. Since 1967, over 400,000. Many were held without any charges whatsoever, under harsh conditions where physical abuse and torture were rampant.
Today, we bear witness to an extraordinary act in one of history's defining dramas.
The Oslo process begins officially with the handshake on the White House lawn.
I think the main misconception is the years of Oslo were years of peace.
And in that period, when there was supposed to be a peace process underway, in fact, the daily lives of Palestinians throughout the occupied territories got worse and worse and worse.
The reality, and I saw it with my own eyes, that this was a new form of Israeli domination over Palestinians.
Economic and social rights, which are rights to health, education, work, etc. These areas are the areas that declined the worst for the majority of Palestinians, almost all Palestinians.
All the economic indicators turned for the worse under Oslo during this peace process.
Moreover, Israeli settlements have continued to expand throughout that period.
At the same time that Israeli control was expanding, the Palestinian Authority was given the trappings of power over the shrinking and non-contiguous Palestinian land, being held out as a future Palestinian state.
The challenges of governing for the Palestine Authority are extraordinarily complex. This is an authority that has very little authority. It has virtually no power. Its power is derivative. It has the power that is given to it by Israel, and at any moment, any of those powers can be taken away.
It was very convenient to believe that there is no occupation, that the occupation is over. How many aspects in your life somebody else determines for you? This is occupation. And Israel could determine, in the last 10 years, could determine everything. But everybody heard Arafat saying 10 times, 100 times, that Ramallah is liberated and Gaza is liberated. How can it be liberated if there is an army around it? The Palestinian officials spoke very warmly about the situation, about the reality, and they were hiding the fact that for the great majority of the population, these years were a disaster.
Those abuses, those violations of the public trust have been happening regularly since the Oslo process began.
Palestinians who would protest against Oslo were labeled as terrorists. The authority would not allow it, the PA.
Instead of having a real national authority, you had this corrupt institution whose main task, as far as Israel was concerned, was to police the Palestinians and prevent them from resisting the continuing occupation.
It has wasted a lot of the money the international community has given it. One sees the villas of the leading Palestinian officials and the poverty with which the Palestinian masses are living in.
The performance of the PLO in running the Palestinian Authority and its failures in negotiating with Israel have very much diminished support for the PLO leadership.
While Americans were being told by the media that a peace process was moving forward, Israel continued its policy of home demolitions. Since 1967, about 12,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished. More than 700 of those homes were demolished during the Oslo peace process.
What you've got to have, and I think it's a fair demand on the part of Palestinians, that during the process of negotiation, you're not turning over more and more territory to Israeli settlers and changing the character of the land that you're supposed to be negotiating about.
The notion that this is going to be a negotiable question does not ring true to any Palestinian who lives up against one of these settlements, which are continually expanding. And what does it mean to expand? It means you steal more land.
Abdul Jawad is a Palestinian farmer whose family has lived there and tended the land for centuries. The Israeli authorities have confiscated countless acres of their farmland.
شوف الشجر اللي كان ما أحللت اللي كان موجود هون. يعني كيف واحد بقعد في جنة أنا مسوي جنة هون. شوف شو بدال الجنة شو سووا معاي. شوف شو هلأ بتتفرج شو هذا اللي سووه هون. شوف الأشجار كيف بيطلعوا من تحت الأحجار. شايف كيف يطلع الأشجار من تحت الأحجار. مش حرام هذا يبقى بدل ما يقعد بني آدم اللي بيقول الله، مش حرام هذا يقعد بداله حجر زي هذا. هذه معيشتنا، لا إنا لا برا ولا بحرا ولا جو، هذه المعيشة تاعنا وبنستنى لطف الله. شو نعمل؟
These settlers live and prosper at the expense of the Palestinians and the Palestinians' well-being, present well-being and future well-being.
And they don't see this horrible disproportionate allocation of resources where Jewish settlers get water and electricity and gas, garbage pickup, all kinds of things that their Palestinian neighbors don't get because of the military occupation.
هذيك المنطقة منطقة بين نعيم ممنوعة تجعلين. هذول الدور شوف يعني في واحد شوف يعني واحد بحوث في قلب الدور من العرب ولا واحد بحوث من العرب موجود هناك. هذه السيارة يعني لو ما هي إسرائيلية بعدوهاش.
They lost the middle of the valley for a bypass road, which is now an Israeli-only bypass road. They can't drive on it to go to their homes.
The thing is extremely ugly to watch. I mean, this is just day-to-day life. I'm not talking about the fighting here. I mean, you walk through Hebron, it's an Arab city, 100,000 Arabs, a couple hundred Jews. Settlers walking around with rifles, you know, looking as if they own the place.
Settlers can go in a Palestinian village and burn the fields there, destroy the house, hit Palestinians, even shoot Palestinians.
Several of the women have been beaten by settlers on different occasions. In each of those cases, we were just being a nonviolent presence on the street, observing when settlers were acting out, and they just attacked different ones of us.
The Israeli government is not doing anything to try and stop the settlers from violating Palestinian rights. From all the cases that settlers actually killed Palestinians, very few were accused of murders, but then the president came and gave amnesty or shortened the punishment that they received from the court. In some cases, they cooperate with them. They guard there. Like one case, the settlers went and took a house, Palestinian house, and just said, well, now it's ours. So the border police stood down there to protect them because the Palestinians were angry. So the border police just stood there and protected the settlers instead of course, arresting them, just saying it's illegal.
The bottom line is to make things so difficult for the Palestinians that anybody that wants a future for their children, anybody that wants to get ahead in life, anybody that wants a normal life will leave.
يعني أنو اللي عنده جنة زي هذه ويعني بده يرحل وبده يروح ويرحل ويدشرها. وين بدنا نروح احنا وندشر ارضنا اللي زي هذه؟
The Jabr family continues to live under constant harassment. Most recently, Abdul Jawad broke his leg while trying to protect his grandchildren from settler attacks.
Many of us feel hostage, that we're held hostage to the settlers. Because I think the vast majority of Israelis don't care about the occupied territories. But we're held hostage to the settlers that have enough political power within the Israeli political system that they can frustrate any attempt to get them out. And as long as they're there, the Palestinians can't possibly make peace.
There are two kinds of settlers, basically. There are the ideological settlers who feel that these territories have been promised to the Jewish people by God, and they feel that every place which is mentioned in the Bible, they have not only the right but the sacred duty to come and to build their modern Jewish settlement. And if Palestinians who live on that spot have other ideas, then they have the right to break their resistance by force or to call in the army.